All praise to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. God is our merciful Father and the source of all comfort. He comforts us in all of our troubles so that we can comfort others. When they are troubled, we will be able to give them the same comfort God has given us. The more we suffer for Christ, the more God will shower us with his comfort through Christ. And over the last few weeks, we have attempted to make some sense of this very difficult question of suffering, often regarded as the single greatest challenge to the Christian faith. We have looked at this subject from a number of angles: philosophically, theologically, biblically, economically. And we'll come into land this morning by talking about it pastorally. And what I want to share with you today will have quite a different feel to the studies in recent weeks. I've been a pastor for 38 years and involved in Christian ministry even before that, during which time I have interacted with, prayed for, counseled those who were experiencing hardship and suffering in their own lives or in the lives of their families. During this time, I have also witnessed the reaction of others to the suffering of their friends, often in a way that brought great comfort and consolation, helping their friends to encounter the peace of God in times of trouble, enabling them to carry on in the midst of the storm. But there have been some other times when the advice, the help, or the counsel, even though well-meaning, was anything but helpful, and sometimes intensified their friends' suffering by bringing the added burden of guilt or condemnation on top of that which they were suffering. I have sometimes been amazed and occasionally dismayed over the comfort, don't miss the speech marks there, offered by some modern-day Job's comforters. Author Philip Yancey tells the story of his friend Claudia Claxton, a newlywed in her early 20s, who had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, a cancer of the lymph glands, and was only given only 50% chance to live. Within a week, her surgeons had removed every visible trace of the disease. Then the treatment started to take its toll on her body. Her beauty disappeared almost overnight. She felt and looked weary. Her skin darkened, her hair fell out, her throat was raw, and she regurgitated everything she ate. Claudia was a Christian and belonged to a church. In her time of desperation, she hoped that her Christian friends would bring some perspective on what she was going through. But so often their voices proved confusing rather than consoling. A deacon from her church visited and solemnly advised her to reflect on what God was trying to teach her. He said, "Surely there is something in your life that must displease God. These things don't just happen. You must have stepped outside of God's will." A few days later, Claudia was surprised to see a woman from her church that she barely knew. Evidently, this rather plump, rather scatter-brained widow adopted the role of a professional cheerleader. She bought flowers and sang hymns and stayed long enough to read some happy scriptures, yay, about brooks running and mountains clapping their hands. Whenever Claudia tried to talk about her illness or prognosis, the woman quickly changed the subject, trying to combat the suffering with cheer and goodwill. But the good news was that she only visited once. Proverbs 25 verse 20 tells us, "Singing cheerful songs to a person with a heavy heart is like taking someone's coat in cold weather or pouring vinegar on a wound." Another woman dropped by, a faithful follower of the television Faith Healers. When Claudia told her about her deacon's advice, the woman nearly exploded. She said, "Sickness is never God's will. Haven't you read the Bible? The devil is like a roaring lion, but God will heal you. If you can muster up enough faith, you will be healed." Just before she left, she said, "Claudia, faith can move mountains, and that includes Hodgkin's disease. Simply claim your promise in faith and then claim your victory. The next few mornings, as Claudia lay there in the sterile treatment room, she tried to muster up faith, as her friend had said. She didn't question God's supernatural power, but she couldn't understand what this woman meant by muster up faith. Wasn't faith, after all, a gift from God? Then she received a visit from a lady who was regarded as very spiritual, who brought her some books about praising God for everything that happens. This lady told her to say to God, "Thank you, Lord, for making me suffer like this. It is your will, and you know what is best for me." As much as Claudia reflected on her words, her mind was filled with a rather grotesque image of God, a God who apparently took great delight in squeezing helpless humans between his fingernails, pulverizing them with his fists and dashing them against the rocks. This God figure would torture these humans until they cried out, "God, I love you for doing this to me." The idea repulsed Claudia, and she decided she could not worship or love such a God. Then her pastor visited. He made Claudia feel as if she was on a select mission. He said to her, "Claudia, you have been appointed to suffer for Christ, and he will reward you. God chose you because of your strength and integrity, just as he chose Job, and is using you as an example to others. Their faith might increase because of your response. You should feel privileged, not bitter. What we see as adversity, God sees as opportunity." And sometimes the notion of being a privileged martyr appealed to Claudia in a self-pitying kind of way. Other times, when the pain crescendoed, when she vomited up food and her throat became too raw to swallow, she cried, "God, why me? There are millions of other Christians more honourable than me. Couldn't you choose one of them instead?" Philip Yancey says that he also visited his friend Claudia. He found her desperately confused by all these contradictory words, which came from sincere, well-meaning Christians. Which of these lessons was she supposed to be learning? How could she have more faith? Which image of God should she embrace? The only thing that she knew with certainty was that a happy world with John, her husband of 1 year, was disintegrating. Yancey said that he didn't have any answers for her, and he left his friend's bedside with some questions of his own. But there was something within him that recoiled at the cliched comments of her visitors. He asked himself, is Christianity supposed to make a sufferer feel even worse? Surely their faith, founded on the great physician, should bring peace, not confusion, at a time of crisis. While there are some elements of truth in some of the comments offered, the truth was also mixed with an awful lot of trash. And in my 38 years as a pastor, sadly, I have encountered the views of all of Claudia's friends at one time or another. Views that often bring confusion and anxiety and guilt and condemnation, views which compound the physical suffering by telling the sufferer that they are deficient in some way, or they don't have enough faith, or that they are sinful and have brought this upon themselves, or that God is wanting to teach them a lesson, or that the character of God is maligned in some way. You see, formulaic answers are so often destructive. A better way forward is to listen to Paul's wise advice in Romans chapter 12. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. We're on the final talk of our short teaching series today. Why, Lord? Wrestling with the mystery of suffering. And I can hardly believe that I have not yet mentioned the book of Job, which perhaps is the most exhaustive treatment on the subject of suffering in the entire Bible. In my first talk, I mentioned the word theodicy, a subsection of Christian theology. It's made up of two Greek words, the word for God and the word for justice, or doing justice to God. Theodicy is about reconciling a God who is all-knowing, all-good and all-powerful with evil and suffering in the world. Now, the story of Job is one of the oldest stories in the Bible. It's an ancient narrative. Actually, it's a Hebrew poem of a man who was an upright spiritual man who loves God with all his heart and yet suffers terribly in his life. Calamity upon calamity, raiders and fire and bandits and a tornado that destroys his ranch and his possessions. Out of his entire family, only his wife survives, and she is not much comfort. Following these calamities, he breaks out in ulcerous boils. Health, wealth, and family are all taken away from him. The pain of loss is something that he can put up with, but what bothers him most is the sense of betrayal. Up until this point in his life, he had always believed in a loving, fair God, but things simply don't add up any longer. Here he is living a godly and upright life, and yet he suffers terribly. Why me? What did I do? What is God trying to teach me? Well, enter into this ancient story Bildad, Zophar, Eliphaz, and Elihu, Job's friends. They were devout and reverent men who rather eruditely discussed Job's suffering. Their conclusions were virtually identical. They all agreed, Job, God is trying to tell you something. No one suffers like this without cause. Common sense and reason tell us that a just God will treat people fairly. Those who obey and are faithful are rewarded by him. Those who sin get punished. So Job, confess your sin and God will relieve your misery. Don't their arguments sound very contemporary? They sound a lot like the arguments of Claudia's friends. What do you think? We rightly criticize Job's friends for their insensitive response to his suffering. But when we carefully read the account, we will notice that the first thing they did was that they came and sat in silence beside Job for 7 days and 7 nights before opening their mouths. Many eloquent words flowed from their mouths, but I would argue that their response to Job's suffering in those first 7 days and nights was the most profound. If you were to ask a person who has gone through an intense time of suffering, who helped you most? I will guarantee that that person will not offer the name of some philosopher or theologian. Most people will tell of some quiet, unassuming person who listened more than they talked, who didn't keep glancing down at their watch. A person who hugged and held their hand and cried with them. Someone who came on the sufferer's terms, not their own, not to preach a sermon. Let me challenge you to read through the 42 chapters of Job, but be warned, it's more than a bit tedious in places. After all the arguments and counter-arguments of why Job had suffered so much, in chapter 38 through to chapter 42, God speaks. And God puts the record right. And God's reply to Job is one of the longest speeches in the Bible. And if you don't have time to read through the many earlier chapters, read through the last few chapters and read what God had to say to Job after he had been through so much trouble. Did he gently place his hand on Job's head and tell him how much he would grow as a person through these trials? Did God express some pride in Job, maybe saying, Job, my son, I know that you had some unfair treatment, but you came through in the end. Well done, Job. A few kind words, a smile of compassion, a brief explanation, maybe. I'm sure all of these things would have helped Job considerably, but God said nothing of the sort. Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them, said God. I find God's response rather astonishing. Let us not forget that the context in which Job heard these words was when he was homeless, friendless, ulcerous, without family or wealth. For the next 4 chapters in our Bible, God chooses not to answer any of Job's questions, virtually ignoring 35 chapters worth of debates on the problem of suffering. But God has some questions of his own. In Job chapter 38, God asks Job questions about the sunrise and the rain and the snow and thunderstorms and lions and mountain goats and ostriches and horses and birds of prey and crocodiles and oxen. And after each question, God either stated or implied, Job, are you powerful enough to duplicate these feats? Are you wise enough to run the world? God even employed sarcasm when he says, but of course you know all of this, for you were born before it was all created, and you are so very experienced. I love that. I've always believed that sarcasm was a godly response, and now feel so much better about my own sarcasm. God's words hit Job with devastating power, prompting him to a place of repentance and surrender. Job simply can't take it anymore, and he says, I know that you can do anything, and no one can stop you. You asked, who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorance? It is I. And I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. In other words, what he was saying is, Lord, you win. Who am I anyway? And what do I know anyway? Did God answer any of Job's questions about suffering and unfairness? No, not really. God saw no need for self-defense. But why did God speak with such forcefulness? What did he want from Job? God simply wanted Job to trust him, an admission of trust. The message behind this wonderful poem of the book of Job, of God's response in chapters 38 to 42, and they can be reduced down to one statement. The whole book can be reduced to this statement. Job, until you know a little bit more about running the physical universe, don't tell me how to run the moral universe. And if we, like Job, are so ignorant about the wonders of the world in which we live, a world that we can see and touch, who are we to sit in judgment of God's government of the universe? God then went on to rebuke Job's friends for their lack of understanding and misrepresentation of God. I said a few weeks ago that the why question of suffering is not that important. It was one that Jesus refused to answer. It was one that God refuses to answer in the book of Job. The more important question is forward-facing, not backward-looking. Instead of why, we need to ask, Lord, to what end? And God's desire is for us to turn to him with trust, which was the place that Job was brought to through God's questions. It was Dr. John Stott who once said, I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of Buddha, his legs crossed, his arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing around his mouth, a remote look on his face detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I have to turn away, and in my imagination I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through his hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood and tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. And in our quest for answers or explanations, we can become twisted emotionally and embittered in spirit. The choice is ours. We can either turn bitter or turn to God for peace and courage. We can either run away from God or we can run to him, where we will find peace and love and hope and courage to go on. Let me finish with a poem written by a then 15-year-old girl named Dora Tenenoff some years back. In 1993, Colombian extremists crossed the border into Panama and went into the village where her dad Rick and 2 other missionaries were trying to make life better for the Kuna Indians. They kidnapped the missionaries, and 32 years on, they remain missing. Their bodies have never been found. In response to this terrible tragedy, she wrote these words as a 15-year-old. There was once a man I once knew, who told me stories every night, laughed at my jokes and held me tight. He told me, don't quit, always fight the good fight. He said, love the Lord with all of your heart and serve him with all of your might. He begged me, do right. There once was a man I once knew, who taught me how to tie my shoe and gently smiled at every picture I drew. He told me, when you start something, don't stop until the job is through. He said, I love you. There once was a man I once knew. I saw him in my dream, and it made me scream. I called out, Daddy, but he told me nothing. He had nothing to say, for what can you say when you are far, so very far away? Daddy, I said. Then a voice echoed in my head. I lay quiet and still in my bed. Again the voice, your daddy made a choice to serve me with all his might, to not give up, to fight the good fight. He is doing a job for me and is not yet through. So remember, I love you. There now is a man I now know. He lived and he died to save men from their sin. He made it possible for us to be born again. I know because my daddy told me so. And even though he's no longer here, my God will always be near to fill in the gaps and show me which way to go. I miss my dad so much, but God has a plan. So for now, I'll just wait and watch the work of his hands. There once was a man I once knew. He's now just a memory, slowly fading away. Dead or alive, you ask, I don't know, I say. So I beg you, please pray. Pray my daddy knows that every night I whisper, Daddy, I love you. There now is a man I now know. Every day he becomes more real to me. Every day in him I grow. Every day I pray that my love for him will show. I've made a choice to serve him with all of my might, to not give up, to fight the good fight. Here on earth, I may not see my dad again, but that's all right, because when my life is through, I'll finally hear them both say, my child, I love you. We all have a choice to turn bitter or turn to God, to find the kind of peace and courage that Dora has found. She found that God is a father to the orphaned and a husband to the widow. God is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Forgive me, I know I've said this many times in our church, that God's ultimate answer to suffering isn't an explanation. It's the incarnation. God isn't some distant, detached, disinterested deity. He entered our world and into our pain. He sits beside us in the lowest places of our lives. From the depths of a Nazi death camp, Corrie ten Boom wrote, no matter how deep our darkness, he is deeper still. Are we broken? He was broken for us. Are we despised? He was despised and rejected of men. Are we sorrowful and grief-stricken? He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Do people betray us? He was betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. You might be struggling with illness, family problems, financial difficulties, bereavement, some depressive illness, divorce, unemployment, or 1,001 other hardships, you might have asked, where is God? Why me? The answer to suffering is the answerer. It is not a bunch of words. It is the word. It is not a tightly woven philosophical argument. It's a person. The person. Emmanuel. God with us. Why don't you reach out to him just now?